Alright, so we're here at CIB and we're going to be doing some honey extraction today. I'm here with Eric, who has brought in some tools that he's going to talk about, equipment, and we're going to extract some honey from some frames here. And Eric, if you just want to talk just a little bit about like what honey is, how they make it, and then when it would be ready for extraction.
Okay, no problem, Chef. Again, Eric, Lemon CIB back in 2018. So as Chef mentioned, we're going to be talking about the honey, some of the tools of the trade, the process we use to extract, and exactly what honey is. So honey itself is basically flower nectar. Nectar is about 70% water. Within that, there are some complex sugars within the nectar, and research suggests that bees have to travel, a hive themselves, travel about 55,000 miles and make about 2 million trips to flowers in order to get 1 pound of honey. And today, we're looking at probably extracting around 100 pounds of honey. So you can do some math and kind of determine just how much hard work the bees actually put into it. But going back to the nectar, bees go out, they collect it, they visit between 50 and 100 flowers during each trip to and from the hive. They bring it back. During that trip back, it's stored in the bee's stomach. And while it's in the stomach just like ours, there's enzymes that are released that help to break down those sugars and the other complex compounds that are in that. They get back, they regurgitate it. And within the hive, there are things called house bees, which are pretty much just busy bees doing their job inside there. They take that regurgitated nectar, and they themselves drink it back up, and it's kind of a continual regurgitation and drink it back process that happens over the course of 1 to 3 days. And during that time, they convert that nectar into what eventually become honey. And also during that time, it goes from roughly 70% water, and it'll whittle down, ideally, once it's stored and capped by the bees, they go down to around 17%. And some of the neat things about honey is you hear it has antibacterial process. It lasts forever, it seems. There's certain compounds called gluconic acid, which are part of those sugars being broken down. One of the byproducts of that is hydrogen peroxide, which we all know is an antiseptic. And there are some other things that also keep it antimicrobial in nature. So that's why this has been sitting in my freezer since July, parts of this, and it's totally good once we do it. And then once you have it in your cabinet, it may dehydrate a little bit, but all you have to do is heat it up, and it's perfectly good to eat even after a couple of years, which is really interesting. So honey itself, really cool thing. As far as the bees themselves, they last about 6 weeks during the summer. And the foraging process, a bee will forage for about 1 to 2 weeks before it dies. So it's a continually renewing process. So all these 55,000 miles that I talk about aren't necessarily just one bee doing that. It's the entire hive over the entire season. All right. Now some of the tools that we're going to use for the extraction process today.
Eric, you want to walk us through some of the equipment used for extracting honey?
Can do. So Chef already showed you the honeycomb, what it looks like. So as you can imagine, which you buy in the store is a nice viscous liquid, but here we have a wax cap on top of the actual comb itself, and you can kind of see some of the glistening bits of honey on there. So how do we exactly get that from the honeycomb into our extractor and ultimately into our bottle? So some of the tools of the trade. In order to get that cap off, we have scrapers, another version of a scraper, just almost like a carving knife that we'll use to actually score the face of that comb off. And a really neat one is a heated knife, which is almost like an iron. You plug it in, it heats up to about 160 degrees, hot to the touch, and you basically run it across that frame, and it'll literally melt that wax cap off. And at that point, the honey will begin to flow. And then once we get that honey to start to flow, we'll have strainers, basically different size mesh. So as it comes out of the extractor, all the bits of wax, the pollen, and there's also little critters that live inside of a hive as well. They get trapped in here, and then ultimately that product that goes into your jar or your bottle or whatnot is going to be filtered to a certain degree. One thing to remember though, typically the stuff that you buy in a store has been pasteurized, it's been heated up. So just like when we do heat up vegetables and whatnot, it loses a lot of those vitamins, minerals, and color and things like that. And a lot of people like to have their honey unfiltered. So if you go to the farmer's market, one of those key things you want to ask is your honey pasteurized or is it unfiltered? All right, what we have here is the actual extracting equipment. Some of it's mechanized. This one happens to just be a hand crank sort of thing. It's a little cheaper on a beekeeper's budget, but what we can do is inside the hopper here, you'll see these wire traps. And the idea is once we score the face of those honeycombs and the honey begins to flow, we're going to insert these into the extractor. Once we load these things up, we'll be able to crank this, and just that centrifugal force is going to draw that honey out onto the walls, and then it'll just flow down to the bottom with gravity. And then on the other side here, once everything pulls up on the bottom, then we'll be able to open that. We'll have our bucket along with our sieve to collect that honey that comes out. And then at the end of the day, like I said before, we have roughly 100 pounds of honey here. So we'll be getting several 5-gallon buckets of honey. And then ultimately, once we get it into a smaller equipment, then we can go ahead and package it into these things that we take to the farmer's market or hand out to your friends and family during Christmas as a cheap gift.
Okay, so I'm gonna decap. Is that what you call it? I like your t-shirt, by the way.
Thank you.
Gonna decap some honey frames so that we can extract the good stuff.
Yep.
So we got a hot knife plugged in, heat knife, nice and hot.
And basically, it's not a precise science here. You're just basically looking to knock the cap off. Since we're not wasting anything, it's actually hitting the... Again, Chef just mentioned about as far as the temperature of where you're doing your extraction is kind of critical, because if you're pulling your frames out of the freezer like I did with these, you have to pull them out several days ahead. All right, now that we've scored both faces of these piece of comb, we're going to put it into the extractor, which is going to be the next part of the process. You want to put it in the hopper. And the idea here is for deep frames, we're able to put 3 deeps in here. If we're looking at smaller frames, we can sometimes double up on the frames. But the idea is fill it, spin it for about a minute, take a peek at it, see if we've extracted most of the honey on that part of the frame, flip the frame over, spin it again. And this process might have to happen 2 or 3 times before we feel comfortable we've got all the stores out of this actual comb. And then we basically repeat the process over and over again until we've gone through all our combs.
So we've got the extractor full now with our frames, and we're gonna spin the honey out.
Pulled it out fairly decent. All right, so at this point, we've extracted all the honey up here in the extractor. We're going to be pulling this up, letting it flow out. We're going to be using these 2 different size sieves to basically take all the pollen, dead bees, things of that nature that are just inherent when you extract honey. It'll flow through, and then once we get up to about right here, we'll go ahead and pour it off into jars, or we'll just let this settle overnight, and then we'll have a better opportunity in the morning after gravity and heat does its part to get everything out of here in a more efficient manner. So here's the exciting part. So that's your unadulterated
honey product. You can see how chunky it is.